Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most high-stakes, dramatic, and, honestly, consequential clashes in human history. We're breaking down a single moment in 1805, where the fate of global empires literally hung in the balance on the choppy waters right off the coast of Spain.
I mean, think about it for a second. How did one agonizingly slow naval maneuver secure 100 years of global empire? It sounds like a total paradox, doesn't it? But as we're going to see, the immense stakes of this 1805 conflict basically came down to a few miles of ocean, some shifting winds, and an absolute tactical masterclass that would completely rewrite the trajectory of the 19th century.
Section 1. The Struggle for Supremacy.
Okay, let's dive into this. In the early 1800s, Europe was locked in this massive, ultimate stalemate. You had Napoleon's France holding absolute, unchallenged dominance on land. His battle-hardened troops were just crushing alliances left and right across the continent. But on the flip side, Britain had unchallenged dominance at sea with the Royal Navy. Now, Napoleon was absolutely determined to defeat Britain, mostly because they were the ones bankrolling all those alliances against him. So he assembled this massive invasion force right on the Channel coast. But to actually get his troops across, he desperately needed to control the English Channel. His big idea? Concentration of force. He wanted to combine all these French and Spanish squadrons that were scattered across different ports to create one giant fleet that could, just temporarily, overpower the British.
Section 2. Cat and Mouse. The guy Napoleon put in charge of this giant combined fleet was French Admiral Pierre Villeneuve. Now, Villeneuve once said, "I have always sought a practical and useful career as opposed to one filled with glory." And honestly, that tells you exactly who Villeneuve was. He was this pragmatic, aristocratic officer who had actually survived the disastrous Battle of the Nile a few years prior. So he wasn't some reckless glory seeker. He knew the capabilities of his fleet, and he knew they were in rough shape, short on supplies, and currently blockaded by the British in the port of Cadiz. So he made a very practical choice. It was safest to just stay put.
But Napoleon? Napoleon possessed absolutely zero patience for Villeneuve's pragmatism. Completely furious that his Grand Cross Channel invasion plans were falling apart, Napoleon wrote, "Villeneuve does not possess the strength of character to command a frigate." Ouch! And he didn't just throw out insults, he literally ordered Villeneuve to be replaced. Well, stung by this incredible insult and the obvious threat to his career, Villeneuve was finally pressured into doing something. On October 18th, against his better judgment, he ordered his Franco-Spanish fleet out to sea. And that brings us to the raw numbers. We're looking at 33 Franco-Spanish ships of the line going up against 27 British ships. On paper, the Royal Navy was heavily outgunned by these colossal floating fortresses. I mean, they had ships like the Spanish 112-gun Príncipe de Asturias, which was truly an awe-inspiring giant of the seas. But the thing is, the British weren't relying on numbers. They knew they could rely on superior seamanship, way faster gunnery, and the brilliant, completely unorthodox mind of their commander.
Section 3. A bold, unorthodox plan.
So, the orthodox naval tactic at the time was pretty straightforward. You line up parallel with the enemy, and you trade broadsides. But Nelson thought this almost always led to indecisive, drawn-out outcomes. So instead, he came up with a radical three-step plan. Step 1, form his ships into two separate columns. Step 2, sail directly at the enemy and pierce their rough, crescent-shaped line completely perpendicularly. Step 3, split that enemy fleet into pieces and totally overwhelm their center and rear in a chaotic close-quarters brawl. The idea was that by the time the enemy's front ships, the vanguard, could slowly manage to turn around and help, the battle would already be over.
It's an absolute stroke of tactical genius, but it leaves us with a massive, terrifying drawback. Think about it. What actually happens when two columns of wooden ships sail head-on directly into the sides of 33 heavily armed enemy warships?
Well, the answer is agonizing suspense. See, the winds were incredibly light that morning, which meant the British columns were creeping forward at around 3 knots. That is barely walking speed. So for 45 excruciating minutes, the lead British ships were completely exposed to heavy enemy fire, and they couldn't even bring their own side-mounted cannons to bear to shoot back. They just had to sail forward in near silence and take a brutal, one-sided punishment.
As Nelson led the northern column aboard his flagship HMS Victory, and Vice Admiral Collingwood led the southern column, Nelson ordered a now historic signal to be hoisted up the masts. It read, "England expects that every man will do his duty." It's just this profound, eerie moment of calm and resolve right before the fleets actually collided and absolute chaos was unleashed.
Section 4. Breaking the line.
Let's move to and see how this builds across the timeline. At exactly noon, the eerie silence breaks as the French fire their first ranging shots. For 30 long minutes, the lead British ships just take a severe hammering. We're talking spars falling, ship wheels being completely destroyed, and casualties rapidly mounting. Then, at 12:30 p.m., Nelson's HMS Victory is finally poised to physically break through the enemy line. And by 1 p.m., the rest of the British fleet starts arriving one by one, piling right into the disordered enemy formation. A massive, totally inescapable brawl develops exactly like Nelson had planned.
The micro-narratives of this brawl are just incredible. The British had deliberately held their fire, loading their cannons with double shot. So when Collingwood's HMS Royal Sovereign finally broke the line, she unleashed this massive, raking broadside, literally firing straight down the entire length of the Spanish ship Santa Ana. Shortly after that, HMS Victory passed right behind Villeneuve's flagship, the Bucentaure, and delivered a devastating blow that crippled the ship and just decimated its crew. When French boarding parties threatened the Victory, HMS Temeraire swept right in to clear their decks with brutal grape shot, which is essentially a giant cannon-sized shotgun blast. We even have Captain Digby of the HMS Africa, who got separated from the fleet, just flat-out ignoring orders to withdraw and casually charging past the entire enemy vanguard all by himself to trade broadsides. That superior British gunnery was just ruthlessly grinding the inexperienced Franco-Spanish crews down.
But right at the height of this fierce, chaotic combat, absolute tragedy struck the British command. Nelson was super easy to recognize walking the deck of the Victory, mostly because he had outright refused advice to take off his bright medals and decorations. A French sniper, perched high up in the rigging of the warship Redoutable, fired a single musket ball that plunged right through Nelson's shoulder and down into his spine. As he fell, he famously stated, "They finally succeeded. I am dead." He was quickly carried below deck to the surgeon, but even then, he kept demanding constant updates on how the battle was going.
Section 5. Victory and Tragedy.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the final tally, because it's almost unbelievable. The British lost 0 ships, not a single one. Meanwhile, the Franco-Spanish fleet lost 18 ships, 17 were captured and 1 was destroyed. Admiral Villeneuve was captured and the Spanish Admiral Gravina was fatally wounded. It was, without a doubt, one of the most crushing, one-sided, and totally decisive victories in the entire history of naval warfare.
The battle functionally ended around 6 p.m. when the French ship Achille caught fire and exploded in this massive, spectacular blast. In total, the actual fighting claims roughly 5,000 lives. But the suffering wasn't over. As Nelson lay dying, his very final order was for the fleet to drop anchor because he sensed bad weather coming, and he was right on the money. A ferocious Atlantic storm soon slammed right into these completely battered ships, howling for days. The storm caused absolute chaos, wrecking a ton of the newly captured ships. Despite immense efforts from the exhausted crews, the British only managed to save 4 of their 17 captured prizes. In fact, historians believe that storm likely claimed way more French and Spanish lives than the brutal combat itself.
And what about Nelson? Down in the dark, bloody, crowded decks of HMS Victory, he died shortly after hearing that his fleet had won a resounding triumph. His last words were basically just whispering that he had done his duty. Now, to preserve his body for the long voyage back home, he was actually placed inside a large cask of brandy that was lashed securely to the main mast. Upon his return to Britain, he was honored with the very first non-royal state funeral in 83 years. His coffin was carried through London by a massive procession, with tens of thousands of people mourning their talismanic hero.
The loss of Nelson was definitely a bitter pill to swallow, but his sacrifice achieved something truly unprecedented. 1805, the victory at Trafalgar. And then nothing. No serious challenge to the Royal Navy at sea until the Battle of Jutland all the way in 1914. Guys, that is more than a century of absolute, completely unchallenged British naval supremacy. Napoleon's invasion threat was permanently neutralized, which forced him to shift his focus to those disastrous land campaigns that eventually led to his downfall. Meanwhile, Britain used that unchecked naval dominance to go out and build the largest global empire in history.
Which leaves us with this final, massive question to ponder today. If Napoleon's ambitions hadn't been crushed on the waves at Trafalgar, if he had somehow managed to control the channel and land those battle-hardened troops on British soil, how vast